Welcome, brothers and sisters, to Education Week. My name is Scott Braithwaite. Today, we're going to be talking about the most important choice you will ever make, whom you will marry. I want to start by introducing myself just a little bit, and I feel like I have to share my most important credential, am I married, and how did it go? So let me do that. First, let me start just by telling you a little bit about my background. I was a student here at BYU. I loved my experience here. I'm a big BYU fan in every way that you can be. I feel, though, like I said, you need to know a little bit about how I chose my own spouse. So it all started at a restaurant. I came back from my mission. I had been home for just a little while, and we started working at a restaurant. Well, I started working at a restaurant, and early on, in the first few days when they're training us, they talked about all the important things like how to wash your hands and how to put the check and all those different things. But they also said, if you look around the restaurant, you'll notice that there are booths in the restaurant. And each of the booths has a name inside of it. Do you know how they get those names? We all said no. How did they get those names? And the manager said, it's if those two people met here at the restaurant and get married, then they get their name in a booth. And I remember, even as a young, impressionable returned missionary, thinking, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I will never get my name in a booth. I will never even date someone that I work with, because why would you do that? You're just begging for trouble if you date people you work with. Until one day, in walked the new crop of employees, and there was a girl among them that I thought, I wonder what her story is. I wonder what her name is. So I put my ear to the ground. I tried to listen to find out what the situation was, and I'll be honest, it was a little unclear whether she was dating someone or not, whether there was someone maybe back in Oklahoma. To this day, it's actually not that clear to me. So because of that, we just became friends, and we would often hang out in groups before that was a bad thing. And then one day I found out for sure she was not dating someone. So I thought, I'm going to make a move. And if I'm going to make a move, I'm going to make the kind of move that someone's going to remember. So I asked her out on a Monday, a Tuesday, a Wednesday, and a Thursday, each of those consecutive days. And each time that I asked her out, she either said yes, but stood me up, or she said no. So by the time we're getting to Thursday, I'm thinking, maybe she's not interested. But I was still undeterred, so I decided it was worth at least one more shot. So on Friday, both of us were working. I went back to where she was preparing a specialty drink for one of her tables. And I said, hey, Kim, so after work, a couple of us are going to go and get dinner. I was wondering if you wanted to come, like a date where we go out to dinner together. And she said, the problem is I'm taking both anatomy and physiology right now, and they are just killing me. I've got to go home and study. I was like, okay, cool. Studying on a Friday night. That's totally plausible. Okay. And so I walked away a little heartbroken, but still kind of hanging on to the hope that maybe she wasn't so uninterested. But before I was out of earshot, I heard one of her friends coming up and making arrangements for them to go dancing that night. So it was like a dagger in my heart, and I thought, this is why you don't ask people out that you work with. And I tried to pick myself up and move on. The next night, it was a Saturday. And oftentimes, apartments of boys and apartments of girls will do things together, and that's what was happening with us. And this group of girls said, hey, we want to go out to eat, and they wanted to go to this restaurant where I had worked. And I was like, anywhere but there. But there were more of them, and I didn't win. So we ended up going back to the restaurant, and there she was again. She was hosting that night. And I don't know why I'm such a glutton for punishment, but I thought maybe just one more time. Like maybe I'll go and talk to her one more time. I don't know what happened. I don't know what the change was that night. I don't know if there was some magic in the fajita smoke on that Saturday, but for whatever reason, suddenly she was interested, and life comes at you fast. Before you know it, there's a booth, and it says Scott, and it says Kim. So we ended up with one. And then, before you know it, we have a whole bunch of kids, and life comes at you fast. Let's see if I can show you some pictures here. We have enormous babies. This is my son Luke, who was 10 pounds, 4.2 ounces. I would like to point out that he peed before they weighed him, so he actually weighed more than that. But we're a happy little family, and so it kind of worked for me. After we got married, I got my PhD at Florida State University. I had two incredible mentors, Frank Fincham and Thomas Joyner. I always like to give them a shout out because they had such an important and powerful influence on me. And then I'm a clinical psychologist, and so for my training, you also do what's called a predoctoral residency or internship. I did that at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston, which is a lovely place. If you've never been to Charleston, you should go. And if you go, I have many, many food recommendations because it is a great food city. Let's come back to the name of this class, the most important choice you will ever make, whom you will marry. Elder Bruce R. McConkie said, "I believe that the most important single thing that any Latter-day Saint ever does in this world is to marry the right person in the right place by the right authority." President Spencer W. Kimball, "Marriage is perhaps the most vital of all the decisions and has the most far-reaching effects, for it has to do not only with immediate happiness, but also with eternal joys. It affects not only the two people involved, but also their families, and particularly their children and their children's children down through the many generations." That's true. The impact of that marriage doesn't just affect the couple, it affects their children, and the patterns of that family do tend to perpetuate through generations, including patterns of divorce. President Hinckley said, "This will be the most important decision of your life, the individual whom you marry. Marry the right person in the right place at the right time." In another talk to the young men of the church, he said this, "The girl you marry will take a terrible chance on you. She will give her all to the young man she marries. He will largely determine the remainder of her life." So I agree with these statements that this is such an important and vital decision because whom you marry changes everything. The choice of who your spouse is has such a ripple effect on so many other things in your life that it's worth paying a lot of attention to. So the question is, what do we know about what predicts marital success versus marital distress? And the answer is we know a lot about this. I'll tell you where my story began. This is my origin story back when I started graduate school. The first task that I was given is to jump in on a project that everybody was already working on. And it was a review paper about all the things that predict divorce. So I started reading stacks and stacks of papers. I read them in my office, but more often at the bookstore and at other places where I could really pay attention to these things. And as I read these papers, I was just stunned at how good we were at this. There are papers that report 94 and 95% accuracy in predicting who will stay married and who will divorce. I think those are probably overestimates. I think that they were able to predict in that particular model that well, but these numbers are sky high. We're really good at predicting this. As I read these papers, I remember thinking to myself, why doesn't everyone know this? Why doesn't every single person have this information? Because then they can make a wide eyes open decision about the most important choice that they will ever make. And so for me, it became a really important goal that in my career, I didn't just want to do good, scientifically grounded psychotherapy. I didn't just want to do good research. I also wanted to get the word out. I wanted to make sure as many people knew about this as possible. So what are some of the things that matter? We're going to talk about a couple different levels, but let's start by talking about personality. So I can't review everything, but I'm going to try to review some of the key highlights. Really important study on this was published in 1987, but they began the study in the 1930s. So in the 1930s, they gave a questionnaire to both partners, and then they also gave it to someone who knew them pretty well, because we tend to think of ourselves, in a little bit of a positive, optimistic light. So they also wanted to include someone who knew this person really well. They didn't include anything about demographics or anything else. What they really were looking at is the impact of personality. And then they followed these couples over 50 years. There's very few studies on anything that span 50 years. Here's what they found. The number one predictor of divorce, which was their only outcome, they didn't look at marital distress, but just divorce, was husband neuroticism. The number two predictor was wife neuroticism. Number three predictor was husband impulse control. And just knowing these three things predicted about 36 to 40% of the variance in outcomes. Just knowing these things about their personality. Neuroticism is kind of a loaded term. I want to make sure you understand what they meant about how they operationalize that in this study. Sometimes we call neuroticism negative emotionality. So it's just a susceptibility to negative emotions. Sometimes if you're really high in neuroticism, you get stressed more easily than other people. There's different ways of it expressing itself. You can be an angry person or more of an anxious person. You can have a lot of guilt, envy, tension. It's just that negative emotion tends to stick to you for longer, and it takes a little bit less to provoke it. But we can think about it as being on a bipolar scale, where at the other side we have emotional stability. And emotional stability, if you're really extreme on this side of things, it's where everything is just water off a duck's back. These people just are not fazed by anything. You could cut off one of their arms and they'll just be like, whatever, man, probably my fault. I'm right-handed anyway, who cares? So most of us are somewhere in between those two extremes, but higher amounts of neuroticism make marriage a little bit harder. So we need to know that as we're evaluating partners. We need to be able to understand maybe where they are on this dimension. Of course, David O. McKay, he talked about this. He didn't know about the study, I'm sure, but at the same time, he knew eternal truths. And he said, in choosing a companion, it is necessary to study the disposition of the one with whom you are contemplating making life's journey. To know that disposition requires some effort. It requires some time together so that you can see how they're going to handle stressful situations. In Moroni chapter 7, we hear about charity. Charity suffereth long. That means charity is patient, is not easily provoked, rejoiceth in truth, beareth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things, wherefore cleave unto charity. We're taught charity is the highest possible ideal, and charity is incompatible with a disposition that is easily provoked, which happens with neuroticism. All of us are working on developing these traits. None of us are going to have them perfectly, but it's important to know which traits are really important when it comes to choosing a partner. So sometimes when you tell people the results of a psychological study, they'll say, yeah, I think I knew that. I think that's common sense. So a lot of times what I like to do is make them go on the record about what they think the finding is before I tell it to them, because everything seems like common sense in hindsight. So you could say there's two competing theories when it comes to choosing a partner. Let's call one of them birds of a feather, and let's call the other one opposites attract. Birds of a feather is the idea that you want a partner who is as much like you as possible, because the more you two are alike, the better things are going to go. You could also say, no, that's a terrible idea. If they're too much like you, they're going to drive you crazy. Instead, you need to balance each other out. You need to have different strengths and different attributes so that in the end you complement, with an E, complement each other. You balance each other out. So, which of these do you think is true? Are we more likely to do well in marriage if we're similar or if we are dissimilar? And I want you to actually make a prediction so that you don't act like you knew it all along when I give you the finding. I want you to write it down. I want you to actually write it down so you're on the record. Okay, now oftentimes in psychology, when we talk about the findings of studies or a theory, the answer is it depends. And knowing what it depends on is what makes you good at your job. But in this case, the answer could not be more clear. It is not an it depends kind of situation. It is birds of a feather all the way. The more alike two people are, the better they're going to do in marriage. This is a principle that we call homogamy. It means that in marriage, you try to be as similar as possible. And across many different dimensions and many different domains, the more alike two people are, the more likely they are to have a really happy, long-lasting marriage. Let me just show you a couple of those dimensions, since I can't review all of them. An important study was conducted by Lehrer and Chiswick in the 90s. What they wanted to look at was the impact of religion. So they looked at all the different possible religious pairings that they could come up with. And they wanted to see if they were homogamous, meaning they were both in the same religion, or if they were heterogamous, meaning one was in one religion, another person was in a different one. What they found, pretty interestingly, is that LDS people were right near the top. So one of the most stable possible pairings is if both people were LDS. Unfortunately, They also found that LDS people were also right at the bottom, that the least stable marriages were actually where one person was LDS and one person was not. I think you can imagine why that might be, and I think it illustrates this broader concept of homogamy. Our church is the kind of church where we make covenants to go all in. We want to make sure that we are completely invested in trying to build the kingdom of God here on the earth. It's not like other religions that maybe don't require that kind of whole-souled devotion. I don't mean to imply that other religions are bad, but many of them, you can go to church on Sundays and that's mostly it. Our religion is an all-in kind of thing. So if one person is in and the other person is not, that's going to create tension when it comes to choices about how to raise children, or which come from marrying out of the church, and the unhappy situations which almost invariably result when a believer marries an unbelieving spouse. I pointed out the demands of the church upon its member in time, energy, funds, and the deepness of the spiritual ties which tighten after marriage and as the family comes, the antagonisms which naturally follow such mismating, the fact that these and many other reasons argue eloquently for marriage within the church, where husband and wife have common backgrounds, common ideals and standards, common beliefs, hopes, and objectives, and above all, where marriage may be eternalized through righteous entry into the holy temple. And it's not just President Kimball. This goes all the way back to 2 Corinthians, where Paul says, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. Come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord." I really like this idea of a yoke. I think many of us have heard in church lessons what a yoke is. This is a picture of one. A yoke, when you have two oxen or two of whatever your beast of burden might be, these look like cows to me, but I admit that I'm not an expert in this area. What happens if you have a yoke is that it doesn't just double the pulling force of that team. It has a much bigger impact than just that. But you can imagine that if the animal is trying to go in a different direction, if they're not aligned or if they're not equally strong, it's going to create problems and tensions, and you're not going to be able to accomplish what it is that you set out to do. So this idea of being equally yoked, I think, is really powerful and beautiful. When you're equally yoked, you can do incredible things. You can have an exponential impact on your own marriage and for the people around you. The only thing that maybe is not great about this metaphor is that you're cows and you're getting married. But also look at that, that's kind of adorable. So I don't have big problems with that. Let's keep going with homogamy. What we find is that just differences in general between individuals are associated with more marital dysfunction. Many different studies show this. President Kimball said the following: "The difficulties and hazards of marriage are greatly increased where backgrounds are different. We recommend that people marry those who are of somewhat the same economic and social and educational background. Some of those are not an absolute necessity, but preferred. And above all, the same religious background without question." So living prophets have taught these truths. Perhaps he knew the social science research. I think he just knows the truth, and he's teaching it with power and with conviction. But this truth is found as well when we reach after it with more worldly or naturalistic means, that we find that these differences do tend to compound problems in marriage. What about education? Let's talk about that one. A lot of times people will ask me, what is the divorce rate? And that's a tricky question because the divorce rate is very different for different people. It's different depending upon how that couple paired up, what the process was, and also with their different backgrounds. But let me show you some data here. So this is from the National Survey of Family Growth. It was the most recent round of this was 2006 to 2010. What they're doing is following people from a nationally representative sample for a really long time. And what they're looking at is what is the probability that a marriage will stay intact. So if you look at the numbers on the screen here, it's the probability that you will stay married. And you can see that there's a pretty significant impact for education. So for example, if we look at the women in the sample, if they have less than a high school education, their divorce rate is much higher than if they have a bachelor's degree. So again, it doesn't do to just say the divorce rate is this. The divorce rate depends on a lot of different things. We see a little bit more parity for men, but you do see that education tends to be protective. Now, does this mean that if people are having marriage problems that I'm going to say you should go get a master's degree? No. I think there's a correlation causation thing that's going on here. But at the same time, I think that seeking education tends to help stabilize families and marriages. I think it's a wonderful thing to do, and it does seem to serve a protective function. Here's what President Hinckley had to say about this. He said, "It is so important that you young men and you young women get all of the education that you can. The Lord has said very plainly that his people are to gain knowledge of countries and kingdoms and of the things of the world through the process of education, even by study and by faith. The more we have education, the more it helps us with marriage and with a number of other things." So I testify that the words of a living prophet are true. I work with a lot of premarital couples. A lot of them are here at BYU, and sometimes we like to get married really quickly. What we find is that shorter periods of acquaintance and courtship are associated with more marital dysfunction, meaning they're more likely to have problems and they're more likely to divorce. So I think it's important to make sure that we invest enough time to know the soul of the person that we're going to marry. It's very hard to do in 6 weeks. And so this is something that can be a little bit tricky and a little bit cultural sometimes, that we get married very quickly. Here's what President Harold B. Lee said. He said, "I'm not trying to urge you younger men to marry too early. I think therein is one of the hazards of today's living. We don't want a young man to think of marriage until he's able to take care of a family, to have an institution of his own, to be independent. He must make sure that he has found the girl of his choice." That's an interesting phrase I'll come back to. "They've gone together long enough to know that they know each other and that they know each other's faults, and they still love each other." That takes a little bit of time to do. But if you can get to a place where you can articulate the faults of the person that you're thinking about marrying and you still want to marry them, that's a great place to be. Young age at marriage is the single most robust demographic predictor of divorce. In some samples, not in the one that I'm going to show you here because it doesn't go on for long enough, but in some samples, if either partner has a teen in their age, the risk of divorce approaches 90%. But let me show you this graph here. So this again is from that same study. That's the most recent data on this from a big national sample. It's the probability of staying married after 10, 15, and 20 years. The data for men and women were very similar, so I'm just going to show you the women's data. What you see is this blue line shows you people who married under the age of 20. And you can see that at every time point, their marriage was less likely to stay intact. So at 5 years, 70% of these marriages were still intact. At 10, 54, 15, 45, and at 20 years, only 37% of those marriages were still intact. Those who married between the ages of 20 and 24 were right in the middle. And then at age 25 and older, those are the ones who at every time point did the best, although they weren't able to see the data here for 20 years out for that group, just because of the way that the cohort worked in the sample. So what you find if you look at other samples is that if we look at this like a risk curve, that the risk seems to kind of asymptote, meaning that it kind of reaches its curve right around 24. That there doesn't seem to be any incremental benefit of waiting past that age. That's really where it seems like maybe we've developed enough maturity that we really know what we want and what we're looking for. For LDS people, if you look just at LDS data, what you find is that LDS people can get away with getting married a little bit younger, but the risk curve is still the same, meaning those who have the youngest ages are the ones that have the highest rates of divorce. So this is something to keep in mind. I don't think it's hard to imagine why this is. Sometimes the things that you think you want when you're 18 years old might not be the things that matter in the long run. For example, when you're 18, it might matter a lot if the person you're thinking about marrying is a cheerleader or a football player. And in the grand scheme of things, nobody cares about that at all. What they care about is whether or not you're kind and responsive and a good person and you change diapers in the middle of the night. And that's really hard to know when you're 18 years old. So you can see that perhaps your values change over time and you get to a place where you're on much steadier footing to be thinking about whom you want to marry, perhaps in your mid-20s. So There's a lot of predictors. I could go into so many of them. And sometimes when I teach this class, I talk about those you can change and those that you can't and how you want to be smart about all of them. This is just a sampling, but I want you to think long and hard about this stuff and educate yourself as much as you can. There's a lot of good research out there. I want to move on, though, to the second big idea that I want to share with you today. And it's to ask this question: who is it that decides whom we marry? Since we don't have people in the room, let me put out some different options. One option is that God decides who you marry. And I see a lot of people behaving as if that's true, because when they think about who they're going to marry, they say the most important thing is to get a revelation that God wants them to marry this person. You could also say you decide who you marry, but that's a different set of beliefs and actions that will go along with it. So I actually think the answer to this question matters a lot. Who decides who we're supposed to marry? Is this something that was decided in the pre-earth life and we have to find the right person here? Do we get to have some say? Do we get to have all of the say? I want you to think about this, because what I'm going to say next might surprise you. Let's start with this idea. Do you have a soulmate? Because if God chose who you're supposed to marry, then it seems like that person would be your soulmate, that maybe you have some sort of connection that transcends this earth and is bigger than that. Well, here's what President Boyd K. Packer said about that. He said, "While I'm sure some young couples have some special guidance in getting together, I do not believe in predestined love. You must do the choosing, rather than to seek for some one and only so-called soulmate, chosen for you by someone else and waiting for you. You are to do the choosing. You must be wise beyond your years and humbly prayerful unless you choose amiss." That seems like a pretty strong answer. Is he the only one who has said that? No. President Kimball: "Soulmates are a fiction and an illusion. And while every young man and young woman will seek with all diligence and prayerfulness to find a mate with whom life can be most compatible and beautiful, yet it is certain that almost any good man and any good woman can have happiness in a successful marriage if both are willing to pay the price." Soulmates are a fiction and an illusion? Ugh, but I want to have a soulmate. That kills me. Let me just say another thing about this quote. Sometimes I hear people quote this at me, and they say, President Kimball said that any two people can get married and it will be fine. It's not quite what he said. Let's be specific here. He said, "It is certain that almost any good man and any good woman can have happiness in a successful marriage if both are willing to pay the price." I think all of those clauses and words matter. I think there's a lot of wisdom there. Let's go for one more. Elder Joseph Fielding Smith is going to put the nail in the coffin here for us. "We have no scriptural justification, however, for the belief that we have the privilege of choosing our parents and our life companions in the spirit world. This belief has been advocated by some, and it is possible that in some instances it is true, but it would require too great a stretch of the imagination to believe it to be so in all or even in the majority of cases." Now at this point, I normally would ask the class to help talk me out of my funk about how upset I am that we can't have a soulmate. And a lot of times they would say something that kind of helps to cheer me up. It's usually something like this: maybe it's actually more romantic that you get to choose. Maybe it's the best thing in the world that when it comes to the most important choice we ever make, that God doesn't remove our agency. Maybe it's more romantic to say, no, it wasn't someone else who chose you. It was I who chose you, and I'll continue to choose you every day for the rest of my life. Maybe that's really where the romance is. And I think they're probably right, and I feel a little bit better. Now, here's where I'm going to go rogue for just a second. They ask us not to try to sell stuff to you guys, but all this talk about soulmates kind of makes me have a good idea, maybe for a business. Tell me what you think. Valentine's Day, it's hard to find Valentine's cards that are doctrinally sound. So I'm proposing maybe we have some doctrinally sound Valentine's Day cards. Tell me what you think. Dearest Kim, although I could have been happily married to a number of other LDS women, you are the one that I chose. Happy Valentine's Day. Hugs and kisses. Scott. Good. I like it. Again, doctrinally sound. I think there's something to be said for that. Let's try another one. Dearest Kim, although we have no scriptural justification for the belief that we had the privilege of choosing our companions in the spirit world, I chose you here in mortal life. Happy Valentine's Day. So maybe we can have romance after all. Maybe we can have a little bit of that kind of magic, just in a doctrinally sound way. Now, you know that I'm being an idiot. I don't actually think soulmates is a helpful idea at all. And I'll tell you why. I think that if you believe that you have a soulmate, if you believe that this is not your choice, it's going to make you do things differently at different phases in the development of your relationship. And I've seen this happen. I've worked with lots and lots of couples. I especially work with premarital couples who are trying to make the choice about who they're going to marry, and I try to help them have the healthiest relationship they can. Here's the thing though, sometimes having the healthiest relationship you can means you break up before you get married. That's a very common thing that often needs to happen. It's not always pleasant, but in the long run, those two people's lives are going to be so much better when they find someone with whom they're equally yoked, when they find someone that they can love with their whole soul. But here's how that could lead us to go astray sometimes. Let's talk about dating and partner selection. If you believe that you have a soulmate, then you might think something like this. There is a one and only, and I've got to find him or her. That's my job. My job is just to define them or to find them. And maybe that's in kind of a mystical, magical way, like I'm using a divining rod to try to find this one and only spouse. What that can do, though, is it can lead us to believe that the hard part is really finding them. It's the conquest. And that once you find someone, that everything else just clicks into place. That's not my experience. I think those folks often underinvest in their relationships. The other thing is that it can create a shopping mentality where we're trying to get the best value for our relationship dollar. And I think that creates a shallow approach that makes it really hard to form close romantic relationships that can be enduring, because we're essentially looking at people as a resume, as a checklist. And that's not how you get to know someone's soul. The other problem here is that, I hate to break it to you, but no one is perfect. And so if you are trying really hard to find your perfect soulmate and you are only able to see people who are imperfect, you sometimes get hung up and you're not able to move forward with really great partners with whom you could be really happy because you're looking for a perfect partner. What about in the early years of marriage? Sometimes people will have, under the surface, this belief that says, I don't have to try as long as I found my soulmate. The hard part was finding the right person, and marriage just works if you found your soulmate. But that's not true. So again, when we look at big nationally representative studies and we look at the typical course of marriage, most people start really happy, and then over time, their happiness starts to dip and it erodes over time. And then some studies show that you get a little bump after the kids leave the house. But if we do other kinds of statistical approaches where we see whether or not there are different groups of people, there's some people who start high and stay high. Do you know what they do differently? They invest in their relationships. Every single day, they intentionally make choices to make their relationship strong. They didn't set their marriage and then forget it. Instead, every day they're thinking, what can I do to help make my marriage strong, to help show my spouse that I love him or her, to make sure that I'm continually making deposits in their emotional bank account so our marriage can be strong. Marriages don't just work if you neglect them. They require investment. And if you believe in soulmates, it's easier to not make those investments. Another thing that sometimes I find that people believe is that they'll always have this intense romantic attraction to their partner if they've really found their soulmate. In fact, sometimes when people start to move from that initial phase that we call infatuation, and they start to transition into the more enduring kind of companionate love that sustains healthy relationships, they think of that as falling out of love. And so they walk away from good relationships and say, I want to feel that feeling again. The problem is that feeling is not meant to last. That feeling, I sometimes compare it to Pop Rocks and Coke. Caffeine-free Coke, let's say. If you've ever had Pop Rocks and caffeine-free Coke, it's sugar on sugar on sugar, and it pops in your mouth, and it's fantastic, and it's over the top, and it's exciting. But if you try to live off of nothing but Pop Rocks and Coke, you are probably going to get rickets. You're going to get sick, you're going to die. because it's not nourishing enough to sustain you. You need to have a well-balanced diet that includes lots of plants, fruits, and vegetables, and legumes, and all these other things that are going to make you strong and healthy. And if you can't transition to that kind of a nourishing diet, it's going to be a problem over the long run. Sometimes people in relationships, they just want a relationship that's Pop Rocks and Coke. But making this transition from infatuation to this deeper kind of love, it's almost like the metamorphosis from a caterpillar into a butterfly. And if people can't make that transition, sometimes it's in those early years of marriage, we see high rates of divorce because they want to hang on to this feeling, this frenetic, intense feeling of infatuation. But love is something more than a feeling. Love is something that we cultivate and that we build. It's something that we do. It's not just an emotion. And by having this thin definition of what love is, sometimes we walk away from good relationships. Here's the other thing, is if you have a soulmate, you might believe that this choice wasn't yours. So if your marriage starts to go poorly, you might think, not my fault. I followed the path that God laid out for me to my soulmate, and it's not working out. But I didn't get to make this choice, so why am I stuck with it? So if we don't have a soulmate, which I hope I've convinced you of, how should we go about finding a husband or a wife? Well, I've got some ideas about that. Here's what Bruce R. McConkie said when he was speaking to the students at Brigham Young University, and I bet this shook them up. He said, "How do you choose a wife? I've heard a lot of people from Brigham Young University and elsewhere say, I've got to get a feeling of inspiration. I've got to get some revelation. I've got to fast and pray and get the Lord to manifest to me who I should marry." Well, maybe it will be a little shock to you, but never in my life did I ever ask the Lord whom I ought to marry. It never occurred to me to ask him, said Bruce R. McConkie. I went out and found the girl I wanted. She suited me. I evaluated and weighed the proposition, and it just seemed 100% to me as though this ought to be. Now, I didn't find this obscure reference somewhere hidden deep in the BYU library. If you look at the handbook that the church gives for the class about eternal marriage, this is the chapter on partner selection, this talk. He's talking about Oliver Cowdery and his experience in Doctrine and Covenants, section 9. You might remember that Oliver Cowdery had been tasked with being a scribe for the prophet as he translated the Book of Mormon, but Oliver really wanted to translate, and there had been some talk in the Revelations that made him feel like maybe that was a realistic possibility. He felt like they got the green light. He tried to translate. It didn't work. And both he and Joseph seemed a little bit confused and frustrated as to why that happened. In response, we get Doctrine and Covenants, section 9. In section 9, the Lord tries to explain this to them by saying, "You took no thought, save it was to ask me, if it be right." But he says, that's not how this works. You don't just ask and then the revelation comes. He says, you must study it out in your mind. And then I will let you know if it is right. If it's right, your bosom shall burn within you, and you'll feel that it's right. And if it's not, you'll have a stupor of thought that causes you to forget the thing which is wrong. But he's saying your mistake was that you just thought, okay, I just asked, the Lord tells me, I move forward. He says, no, you've got to study it out in your mind. You have to do your homework. You have to figure out what you can do to figure out the problem. And then after that, I'll help you know if you've gotten it right. Bruce R. McConkie continues, now seemingly that's all he, Oliver Cowdery, had been instructed to do, to ask in faith. But implicit in asking in faith is the precedent requirement that we do everything in our power to accomplish the goal that we seek. We use the agency with which we have been endowed. We use every faculty and capacity and ability that we possess. This is translating the Book of Mormon. It's choosing a wife. It's choosing employment. It's doing any one of 10,000 important things that arise in our lives. There is a fine balance between agency and inspiration. Sometimes we want revelation because we don't want to make a choice. We think this is too hard and I don't know how to do it, so I just want you, Heavenly Father, to tell me what to do. But that's not what we came here on earth to do. We didn't just come here to be a good soldier who's perfectly obedient and does everything that they're asked to do. That's an important first step. But then at some point, God's going to say, I don't just want a good soldier, I want a general. I want someone who knows how to think. I want someone who knows how to make choices. I want someone who doesn't have to be commanded in all things. I want you to be able to study it out in your mind, to do everything that's in your power to accomplish the goal that you seek. And I will help you along the way. But as Elder McConkie says, there's a fine balance between agency and inspiration. Elder Glenn Pace talks about this problem, and he says that there's sort of two extremes that are probably too far when it comes to trying to make an inspired decision. He says, on the one hand, you have folks who neglect the gift of the Holy Ghost and are purely rational in making important decisions. That's a mistake. We don't want to do that. He then says, on the other hand, people on the other end of the spectrum think something like this. I know the church is true, and I have received the gift of the Holy Ghost. I am a worthy member of the church and therefore have access to the Spirit. When faced with a problem, they will pray for an answer and then canonize the first thought that comes to mind. He says this is also a mistake. I believe, Elder Pace continues, that an idea or a solution that comes without appropriate reasoning is nothing better than a hunch. There are times of instant inspiration, but they are rare and usually involve an emergency. And despite what you may think, deciding who you marry is very rarely an emergency. So, here's another story that he tells that I think illustrates this point. Before Elder Pace was a member of the 70, he was an employee of the church. And he was helping the church as they transitioned from a previous iteration of the welfare program to one that's much more like what we use today. There had been a successful welfare program that had been implemented in stakes, and they wanted to take it church-wide. This meant they had to make a ton of decisions, and he had been tasked with figuring out what to do. He said, I was overwhelmed by this. There were so many important decisions that I just didn't know how to make, and I thought, my goodness, we need revelation on these issues. Then he said, I had a thought. I'm in meetings with members of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 regularly. And nobody is better at receiving revelation than them. He said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this meeting and I'm going to ask them to give me the revelation on the topic. Quoting from Spiritual Plateaus, he says, then I sat back with my pen and yellow notepad and waited for the pearls of wisdom. I was devastated when their collective counsel amounted to this. Brother Pace, we commend you for your concern and conscientiousness in finding solutions to these weighty matters. We too have some deep concerns and anxieties, and you are absolutely right. We do need revelation. Now go get it. Who, me? Elder Pace said. Not Elder Pace at the time, though. I was an employee of the church, not a general authority. However, I had been taught that I had the responsibility to take to the brethren well thought out recommendations that could be confirmed, modified, or rejected. It was my obligation and right to receive revelation. And I knew that inspiration would come only after intense, agonizing study, research, and meditation. In other words, I learned that revelation is 95% hard work. Let me repeat that. Elder Pace says revelation is 95% hard work. Do you believe that's true? Oftentimes we think just the opposite. We think if I didn't do anything and the answer came, that's even more evidence that it's revelation. But these statements from living prophets and from Scripture tell me that that's not the case, that we have an obligation to study it out in our mind, that we have to get comfortable with the fact that there's a balance between agency and inspiration, and if we want revelation, we have to work hard. I'm mindful of what President Hinckley said when I was younger. He would say, I want you to get on your knees and pray as if everything depends on the Lord, and then I want you to get up on your feet and to work as if everything depends on you. I think that's a good way to live your life. So how do I do that work? How do we study it out in our minds? Well, I have a crazy idea. I want you to go on dates. We live in a world where, especially for LDS folks, dating feels really serious and strange. There's a lot of hanging out, and I think that that's not the way to go here. And Elder Oaks, in a wonderful talk that he gave in 2005, talked about the important difference between dating and hanging out. Dating is where we pair off, and we have even the littlest bit of commitment. Just for one night, it's going to be the two of us, and we're going to talk. We're going to do something together. I think that the more that you date a number of different folks, the more likely it is that you're going to find an excellent match. The most unromantic people in the world are probably economists. And the way that economists talk about this is they talk about it like it's a marriage market. And the more time that you circulate on that market, the better you're going to find someone who fits you really well. Super unromantic, but also very true. But if you marry the first person you date, or if you simply just don't have that many experiences dating and you just say, okay, well, God's going to tell me who to marry, it's going to lead to some problems. So dating is part of how you study it out in your mind. Another thing is I want you, as things progress, at the right time in your relationship, as things are starting to move forward, I want you to remain open to important things that you might not want to see. If you start doing this too soon, it's going to make you finicky and difficult. But after you've kind of been in a relationship for a period of time, what we find is that we start to engage in what we call motivated cognition. That's a fancy way of saying that we see what we want to see. And we kind of irresponsibly discredit information that doesn't let us go in the direction that we want to go. So the problem with that is that serious dating is not like regular life. Sometimes you want to get a glimpse of what this person is going to be like in regular life. But when we date, everybody's on their best behavior. They're really nice. They open your door, they pay for dinner, they plan really nice dates. Are they going to keep doing all of that stuff even once they've caught you? It's a little bit like fishing or hunting. That when we're fishing or hunting, we behave in ways that are very different than we behave in regular life. But once we've caught the person, then we're going to go back to our regular life. You want to know what regular life is going to be like with this person, not how they behave when they're trying to catch you. That means it's really hard to do this if you don't date for very long. And the other thing is that you want to be realistic. You don't want to ignore important red flags. If someone is really unkind to people on the periphery of their life, there will be a period of time where those same habits and patterns will affect you. So we want to be paying attention to their deeds, not their words. Everybody knows how to say the right thing, and we can all behave pretty well for a period of time, but over time, the most reliable information comes from what people do, not what they say. Elder Bednar, I think, gives a great example of this in a talk that he gave in the early 2000s when he was the president of BYU Idaho. He said, Sister Bednar and I knew each other for 19 months and dated for 15 months before we were married. That's a long time in Provo. I do not recall ever receiving a single overwhelming spiritual confirmation that she was the one, in scare quotes. I do recall that as we dated, as we talked, as we became better acquainted, and as we observed and learned about each other in a variety of circumstances, I received many small, simple, and quiet reassurances that she was indeed a remarkable and spiritual woman. Notice he didn't say that she was the one. All of those simple answers over a period of time led to and produced an appropriate spiritual reassurance that indeed we were to be married. That reassurance did not come all at once. Rather, it was spiritually subtle and gradually distilled upon our minds as the dews from heaven, as described in the 121st section of the Doctrine and Covenants. I think he lays out a wonderful template for the timeline and the process about how to choose a spouse. Now, after a class like this, it's really tempting to say, so I need to make a checklist of all these things, right? You've laid it out, low neuroticism, high education, right? That's what I'm supposed to do. What I'm trying to do is to open your eyes and to make sure you know some important things. But how we do this matters. Lots of times, back when you were in seminary, or young women's or young men's, I find it's more young women's than young men's, sometimes you made a list of all the things that you wanted in your future husband. Here's a possible list here. Doctor, lawyer, or dentist, taller than me, former member of One Direction, future apostle. We're starting to get very low probability here. Looks like Mr. Darcy, the BBC one, not the movie one. Don't get a detail like that if you're making this up. Is named Harry Styles. Now, I don't think there's very many people who would fit that list. What do we do with this list? If you have a list, the list is for you. You need to develop the attributes that you hope to attract in someone else. If we want someone who has developed their character and become something that we're really excited about, we need to have become that person. We see this truth taught in the Doctrine and Covenants in section 88, where it says, "For intelligence cleaveth unto intelligence. Wisdom receiveth wisdom. Truth embraceth truth. Virtue loveth virtue. Light cleaveth unto light." I testify that as you develop these virtues, as you develop these capacities, that you can become attractive to the people that you hope to marry. The best, most important things in life don't come without effort or intention, but they can come if we're willing to invest and if we're willing to make important choices and to stand by them. President Monson, I think, said it best. He said, "Choose your love, love your choice." And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.